Hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the co-authored volume Beyond Justification, Liberating Paul's Gospel. It's written by Douglas Campbell and John Depue, and it's put out by Cascade. Thank you to Cascade for sending me this for review. This is my honest reaction to this book. I'll take you through my format of the main idea of the work, the research behind it, the readability of it in its style, and then my general reactions to the whole thing. Yeah, there's a lot going on in this book for its relatively short length, so I'm going to try to wrestle down the main idea here quickly. That'll be a little challenging. But here we go. This book is attempting to do a couple things. It's primarily attempting to respond to, or it's attempting to articulate and respond to what they term justification theory, which is a particular rendering of Paul's soteriology in his epistles, especially Romans and Galatians. And they are responding to it because this is a very, very prominent way of articulating Paul's understanding of salvation through Christ, particularly in Protestant and especially in Calvinistic or Reformed Christian cultures, subcultures, Christian traditions, especially in America and especially in the West. So justification theory is their moniker, how they label this way of talking about the way Paul talked about salvation. And it's primarily involves that phrase justification by faith. And it's really represented most probably publicly by someone like a John Piper, the Gospel Coalition, Acts 29, anything in that very Reformed Calvinistic kind of wing or Christian tradition. They'll talk about justification by faith as the gospel or as the kind of primary way to salvation, as especially as Paul talked about it. So what they're doing in this book is called Beyond Justification. So they're responding to that, they're critiquing it, they're pushing beyond it, but they're doing multiple things. The co-authors are doing multiple things in this. So one thing that they're doing is they are articulating justification theory so that the reader understands what exactly they're responding to. I'll say more about that in my reaction, but they spend multiple chapters to just walking through what justification theory is. They're also taking a survey of some of Paul's writings, and they make the argument that this justification theory only represents about 10% of what Paul wrote, and there's another 90% of his writings that are kind of marginalized by justification theory. They're also surveying the so-called new perspective on Paul, because they rightfully see that as trying to respond to or almost kind of fix what's wrong with justification theory. And so they survey people like E.P. Sanders, Jimmy Dunn, and N.T. Wright, and kind of portray their responses to the justification theory gospel. And then they're doing a lot. They're doing an extremely close reading, especially of Romans, to unpack their proposal, which is not justification theory. They're proposing something other than justification theory, and therefore they have a proposal about what Paul is actually doing in Romans that is not just justification theory. So, yes, it's a lot. They're articulating justification theory. They're naming it, articulating it. They're surveying Pauline scholarship, especially the new perspective on Paul, and talking about how that area of scholarship has responded to justification theory. And then they're proposing an alternate understanding of Paul, very, very rigorously rooted in, especially in some chapters in Romans. And that's where the last section of the book takes you through of their reading of key chapters in Romans, and what they see is actually going on there. So ultimately, they want to say that justification theory is not Paul's gospel, and that Paul is actually doing something very different, and that most new perspective on Paul's scholars don't actually follow their intuitions or their findings far enough. People like N.T. Wright or Jimmy Dunn don't follow their intuitions far enough to question justification theory at its root and put it more in balance with the rest of what Paul's gospel is in all of his other writings. So it's a lot. And it's not a super long book. It's about 300 pages, so they cover quite a lot. They cover a lot of ground and not a lot of page count, relatively speaking. So the research of this book, so Douglas Campbell is someone who has done a lot of Pauline scholarship. I have not read The Deliverance of God, which is his famous, it's like over 1,000-page book on Pauline theology. He's done a lot. Pauline dogmatics is another big one that he's done. But Douglas Campbell is a known figure in what's called the apocalyptic school of Pauline scholarship. It's kind of a Bardian. It's in the realm. If you know these scholars, it's in the realm of Bart or maybe the Torrances in kind of their rendering of Paul. Um, so yeah, that's where Douglas Campbell's coming from. And this book is, in some ways, this is kind of, other scholars do this too. Like N.T. Wright does this a lot. Greg Boyd does this a bit, where they have massive volumes that then get condensed and repackaged in like more accessible volumes. And I think that this is kind of what this book is. I think this is John Depue coming alongside Douglas Campbell and then maybe taking some of his work in volumes like The Deliverance of God and repackaging it in this smaller, more accessible format. And I'm saying all that to say that a lot of the research is on other work that Douglas Campbell has done. It's not exclusively that. There's a lot of biblical exegesis here, like a lot, and a lot of discussion of the Greek. There's a lot of research in the kind of rhetorical strategies of Paul, which is another sub area of Pauline scholarship. And there's also there's a lot of interaction with other scholars, notably John Piper. I think they do a remarkably good job at giving a fair shake to how someone like John Piper articulates what they call justification theory. They do a very careful reading of it, and I think they represent it fairly and well, actually. They're steel manning the thing that they're responding to. So there's a really close reading of that more reformed understanding of Paul. And then they also interact with some other apocalyptic, like Lou Martin is another one, a very, very well-known apocalyptic scholar, apocalyptic Paul scholar that they interact with. So yeah, there's a lot of different kind of sub areas of research there, but it's a well-researched, well-cited, well-footnoted book that can point you in lots of other directions if you want to chase down any of these subtopics. So that's the research. The readability of it is, in general, it's very readable in the realm of academic works. It's not super long for the ambitious goals of the book. It's actually quite short. The chapters are quite short. But I will say the readability varies on the kind of section of the book you're in. I found certain parts much more readable than others. Probably the driest section, I'm guessing, for most readers is going to be when they're surveying the New Perspective on Paul. I was really interested in those chapters because I've kind of followed the New Perspective for a while and been and I actually think, I actually love that section of this book because I think they do a really good job at clearly delineating, like, here's how N.T. Wright and Jimmy Dunn are very different, for example, and here's kind of the goals that they each were bringing to their scholarship. And I don't know, as just someone who's interested in that field of study, those are really helpful chapters for me. But the readability is going to go up and down. When they get into Romans, it's a very careful exegetical step-by-step walkthrough. So that lends itself towards being a little bit more of a drier or more deliberate kind of reading in those pages. But I don't want to overstate any of that. If you're someone who's read Douglas Campbell before, you're not going to have any problems with this. If you're someone who's generally if you've read N.T. Wright, if you've read basically the scholars that I've been mentioning, you're probably not going to have any trouble with this book because it's not written to be inaccessible. But it does, because it's pretty ambitious in it, because it is responding to a lot of things. There is a lot going on that, if anything, you might need to like deliberately go a little bit slowly through it because it's doing so much in a pretty small page count. So that's some thoughts on the readability of it. Okay, now my reaction to this. This is a lot. There's a lot to react to here, and I've been kind of wrestling to the ground how I'm going to summarize my reactions to this. But a couple things I want to say. One of the big light bulbs for me, that I think one of the most successful elements of this book, is the way that they articulate and encapsulate and label what they call justification theory. I think that the way that they step through that is so clear and so helpful. And I had light bulbs going off as I was reading that. I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is exactly how I've heard the gospel according to Paul presented to me my entire life. And they walk through, they have this box A, box B graphic that they use to capture how the gospel is presented, which is to say that there's a sense in which this reading of Paul is saying that Paul is putting forward this idea of living under the Jewish law as box A. And there's this idea that box is intentionally designed to create pressure because humans can never live up to that box, those stipulations. And so this rendering of Paul's understanding here is making the case, like the John Piper would make this case, that box A is designed to kind of make you fail and make you realize that you can only fail and that you can never live up to it. And so it's supposed to create this pressure on you, this like almost existential pressure on you to look for salvation somewhere else, which they say is box B, according to justification theory. And then box B is, you probably guess, justification by faith alone in Christ, through the work that Christ has done and nothing that you've done. And so there's this idea that box A is almost this pressure cooker that's supposed to turn you back in on yourself as kind of coming to your limits as a human, that you inevitably fail, and then you kind of get squeezed so much in that box that you throw yourself into box B, and you discover justification by faith, salvation by faith alone, all those kind of Protestant maxims, and then that's how you're freed to faith in Christ and find salvation. That's like their rendering of justification theory, and I think it's really successful, and I think it's very clear, and I think it's fair to how someone like Piper would render it. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is so helpful, because this is helping me label and understand what I've been taught so much. And I've been taught so much that the Romans Road is another way it's packaged. But I've been taught, and if you grew up in conservative evangelicalism, you likely have as well, you've probably been taught that not only is what Paul teaches, but that is itself the gospel. Like, that is the way to understand the gospel, and any deviation from that is to compromise the integrity of the gospel itself. And so they lay that all out extremely clearly, extremely fairly, and I found that so helpful. I also mentioned that I found the survey of the New Perspective on Paul very helpful. I really like those chapters because, again, personal interest of mine, if you're really interested in the New Perspective and haven't quite wrapped your mind around it, you probably would really like those chapters too. Super, super helpful for just kind of... It's also very helpful for... I thought that I'm someone who really likes N.T. Wright, and I found that their critiques of him were also very fair and very helpful to also understanding what maybe some of his limitations of his scholarship. They're very respectful of him, and they're very respectful of all the New Perspective scholars they interact with, but they also, I think, level some very fair critiques of him, and ultimately make the case that he kind of lapses into just, it's like a slightly modified or transposed version of justification theory, but it's still essentially justification theory. It's that same progression from box A to box B. And I think that's all fair. I think it's all really helpful. I walked away thinking with a much better understanding of kind of this landscape of scholarship on Paul, and I really appreciated all of that. But there's this like heart and soul of the book, and I'm still wrestling with, and I'm going to be honest about that. I'm not sure where I'm going to land on this. There's something super compelling about it, but I think I still have questions. And in fact, I'm thinking more seriously about, at some point in the near future, diving into Douglas Campbell's Deliverance of God, because I want to maybe dig into the root of this some more. So that in itself maybe is the success of the book if it gets me to read the Deliverance of God, which is this like 1,100-page monstrosity. But here it is. Here's the core. Here's what I see as kind of the core. I think this is a fair way to say what the core of their argument is. Their argument is that whole box A, box B, feel the pressure of box A and then throw yourself into box B. Their whole thing is that is just not the right way to conceive of Paul at all. You've got to utterly rethink everything underneath, all the roots of that way of thinking about Paul, approaching Paul. So their notion is that box A is actually the presentation of the Jewish law and salvation through the Torah. Box A is actually how Paul's so-called enemies are presenting their understanding of the gospel, is box A. And it's completely not what Paul is interested in. It's not remotely or at all related to Paul's gospel. It's actually a different gospel, which is what the reason they rely on Romans and Galatians so much is because Paul is attacking that gospel. Is to say, don't listen to these, I think some translations call them Judaizers. Don't listen to these teachers who are trying to tell you to, find salvation in this way through like following the law and all that. And they go into, I'm butchering because I'm trying to summarize so much. I'm probably butchering their explanation of it, but their contention is that box A it's not a progression, go from box A to box B. It's that box B is the utterly wrong gospel, and that Paul is responding to that. And so he's not acknowledging that you necessarily need to go through box A to get to box B. He's saying box A is completely wrong, root and branch, don't go that route at all. Instead, box B, the justification by faith. The justification by participation, by union with Christ. So that's a really radical rethink. And that's what I'm still wrestling with. And I do love another thing I will say in pro, I love the emphasis on what I just said, participation with, union with Christ. That takes into account, I do think they're right that takes into account much more the other 90% of Paul's writings, aside from just the 10% on justification by faith. I think that this participation, union with, relationship with, suffering with, all of that is so good. And I love that theme in the book. And I think that they're onto something there. Which is more in the box B thing. But here's the thing I'm still wrestling with. They do a very close reading of Romans, and a lot of their argument rests on the idea that box A is this rhetorical representation of Paul's enemies' teachings. And they make this claim that those teachings show up in Romans in certain verses, and it's not actually Paul representing his own thinking. It's actually Paul recapitulating the teachings of his enemies and then responding to them within the same letter. So there's this back and forth. They're claiming there's this back and forth that's happening in Romans, that Paul is saying, here's what the teachers are saying, here's what I'm saying, here's what the teachers say, here's what I say, and that there's this back and forth that's actually the exegetical basis for the rejection of box A, so to speak. There's something very compelling about that, and it does, if they're right, it does resolve a lot of tensions in Paul's writings. And that is what I'm wrestling with still, I'll be honest. That's what I'm still wrestling with, because I went back and reread that section of Romans, and I just thought, I couldn't help but think, like, if Paul was really making such a delineation between his teachers' teachings and his own teachings, couldn't he have maybe made that a little clearer in his own way of rendering it? I'm not sure. I'm not, like, clapping back to that as a slam dunk, this is wrong, but I'm wrestling with it because there's so much that's compelling about the way that they present that reading of Romans, and it does resolve some of these other issues, and I do think their understanding of justification theory is so helpful, and I do think there's something really off about that way of talking about salvation in Paul's epistles, but I'm still wrestling with it. Is it true that all the New Perspective scholars have not gone far enough, and that what we actually need is a more radical, more apocalyptic rethink of Paul's theology here, that down to the root, get underneath all these edifices we've constructed over the centuries of Christian tradition and get down to the root and then rethink them from that level up? Man, it's an exciting thing to think about. It is pretty radical, and it's unlike anything I've read before, and so it's really making me wrestle, and I'm still wrestling with it, which maybe that in itself is a mark of the book's success. It really provoked some thought in me and provoked some wrestling with me, and I think it's going to provoke me to keep diving more deeply into Douglas Campbell's apocalyptic gospel, the deliverance of God being the next stop, or maybe Pauline dogmatics, I'm not sure. But I would say, if you're someone who's really interested in all these debates around New Perspective, whatever, Old Perspective, if you've been a John Piper defender, or if you've been somebody who's the N.T. Wright camp, or I don't know, if you're anywhere in all of that, if you're interested in all this stuff, Beyond Justification is a fantastic book to get, if nothing else, because it's going to provoke a lot of thought. It's going to provoke a lot, and it also helpfully summarizes and delineates a lot of the current landscape of Pauline thinking right now. So, gosh, there's a lot to appreciate about this book. There's a lot to be gleaned from reading and wrestling through it. And if any of that sounds good to you, then I would highly commend Beyond Justification by Depue and Campbell to you. As always, thanks for taking some time to watch.